There's a strange pull at the center of all in the family that doesn't really make sense the first time you try to explain it. Because on paper it sounds like something that shouldn't work at all. A character who is so often wrong, so consistently rooted in ideas that clash with the world around him, somehow becoming the reason you keep watching, the reason you lean in instead of turning away. And that character, of course, is brought to life by in a way that feels almost effortless until you really stop and think about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because Archie Bunker isn't designed to win you over in the traditional sense. He doesn't soften himself to become likable. He doesn't evolve quickly enough to reward your patience with easy change. He doesn't give you the satisfaction of resolution. And yet you stay. You keep watching. You find yourself drawn back into that living room again and again, even when you know what kind of conversation is about to unfold, even when you can already feel the tension building before a single word is spoken. And the question slowly forms almost without you noticing. Why? Why does a character who is so often wrong become so difficult to look away from? And the answer isn't simple, but it starts with something very human: familiarity. Not agreement, not approval, but recognition. Because the way Archie speaks, the way he reacts, the way he holds onto his beliefs with a kind of stubborn certainty, it feels familiar. It feels like something you've encountered before, maybe in someone else, maybe in a room that felt just a little too tense, maybe in a conversation that didn't quite go the way it should have. And that familiarity doesn't comfort you. It unsettles you. But it also keeps you engaged. Because it feels real. And once something feels real, it becomes harder to dismiss. Now add to that the setting, that living room, that quiet, ordinary space that somehow becomes the center of constant emotional friction, where conversations don't happen in isolation but in proximity, where people can't simply walk away from disagreement because they live inside it. And that changes everything. Because now the arguments aren't abstract. They're personal. They carry weight. They linger. They echo through the space even after they end. And Archie exists right in the middle of that space, not as a neutral presence, but as a force that shapes every interaction, every shift in tone, every moment where things feel like they might settle, and then suddenly don't. And what's remarkable is how the show doesn't rely on traditional comedy to carry those moments. It doesn't rush to a punchline to release the tension. Instead, it lets the tension sit. It lets it stretch. It lets it become part of the rhythm of the scene. And Archie's role in that rhythm is crucial, because he doesn't just create conflict, he sustains it. He keeps it alive through repetition, through resistance, through the way he returns to the same ideas again and again, not because he hasn't heard the counterarguments, but because those ideas are part of how he understands the world. And that's where things become more complicated. Because once you realize that Archie isn't simply refusing to change, but is holding onto something that feels essential to him, the character shifts slightly. Not enough to make him right, but enough to make him understandable. And that distinction matters, because understanding creates space. It doesn't excuse. It doesn't resolve. But it allows you to stay in the conversation instead of shutting it down. And that's exactly what the show depends on, your willingness to stay. Now bring in the other characters, and the dynamic becomes even more layered. Mike challenges Archie directly, pushing against his ideas with a kind of intellectual confidence that feels both necessary and incomplete, because logic alone doesn't dismantle belief, especially when that belief is tied to identity. Gloria brings an emotional dimension, a sense of frustration that isn't just about ideas, but about what those ideas do to relationships, about how they create distance even when people are physically close. And changes everything, because she doesn't engage in the same way. She doesn't try to win. She doesn't escalate. She softens. She redirects. She introduces a kind of warmth that doesn't erase the tension, but changes how it feels. And Archie's response to her reveals something you might not expect. Because in those moments, the certainty wavers just a little. The tone shifts. Something quieter appears. And it doesn't last long. It doesn't transform him. But it's there. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Those small moments begin to accumulate. They sit alongside the louder ones. They complicate the character. They make him harder to define. Because now he isn't just wrong. He's layered. He's contradictory. He's capable of reactions that don't fully align with his stated beliefs. And that's where the performance becomes essential. Because he doesn't smooth out those contradictions. He doesn't guide you toward a single interpretation. He lets everything exist at once. The confidence and the insecurity. The rigidity and the hesitation. The frustration and the quiet, almost hidden moments of vulnerability. And that coexistence, that refusal to simplify, it's what keeps you watching. Because you're not just observing a character. You're trying to understand a person. And understanding takes time. It requires attention. It requires you to stay even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Now consider the time in which this was happening. A period where television wasn't used to this kind of honesty, this kind of direct engagement with social tension, this willingness to let conversations remain unresolved. And suddenly, here is a show that places all of that at its center, that builds its identity around disagreement rather than resolution, that trusts the audience enough to sit with complexity instead of avoiding it. And Archie becomes the focal point of that experience, not because he represents a solution, but because he embodies the problem. And that's a risky choice, because it means the audience has to engage actively, has to think, has to react. has to navigate their own responses in real time. But it's also what makes the show feel alive. Because nothing is being handed to you. Everything has to be processed. And that process, that ongoing engagement, it creates a kind of investment that simpler shows don't always achieve. You don't just watch, you participate, even if only internally. And that's why you can't stop watching. Not because you're waiting for Archie to be right, but because you're watching how he continues to be wrong, how he defends it, how he lives inside it, how it affects everyone around him, and how, despite everything, the conversation continues. It doesn't end. It doesn't resolve. It carries on. And that persistence, that refusal to reach a clean conclusion, it mirrors something real. Because in life, these conversations don't wrap up neatly. They repeat. They evolve slowly. They resurface in different forms. And the show captures that. It doesn't fix it. It reflects it. And Archie, in all his contradictions, sits at the center of that reflection. And maybe that's the real reason you can't look away. Because somewhere in all that tension, all that discomfort, all that unresolved conflict, there's something recognizable. Something that feels true in a way that's hard to ignore. And once you recognize it, once you feel that connection, even if it's uneasy, even if it's frustrating, you stay. You keep watching. Because you want to see what happens next. Even when you already know. Even when nothing really changes. Because the experience itself, the conversation, the tension, the subtle shifts beneath the surface, that's what keeps pulling you back. And that's what makes Archie Bunker not just a character you react to, but one you can't quite let go of.